Good afternoon. My name's Danielle Levitas, and I head the research team for a company called App Annie. For those of you that may not be familiar with App Annie, we're a company that provides the data and insights to companies across industries and across the globe to help them succeed in the app world that we live in today. And as head of research, I have the good fortune of leading the team that gets to spend time with our data to look for the signals and the stories that our data tells and informs. And what I'm here to share with you today is a small piece of this, and specifically some of the why and the how to grow engagement with your customers through mobile. So we all know that we have gone mobile. From the moment we wake up in the morning to the time we go to bed, our phone is with us for better and for worse. And when you think about it from just a general stats standpoint and the growth that we've seen and the growth that we're going to see, some key stats to keep in mind. First of all, obviously, we wouldn't even care about mobile and apps if we didn't have a base of devices to work from. Today, it's all about the smartphone, and it will be for some time. And the fact of the matter is, today we're at over 3 billion mobile devices globally that are actively used, and by the end of this decade, we'll be at over 6 billion. When you think about what this means from an app standpoint, obviously the first place we start with driving app engagement is first with that install. And we're seeing downloads continue to grow at a phenomenal rate, reaching over 300 billion at the end of this forecast period. If you think about time spent, and I'll spend some time on this during this presentation, there are critical metrics when you start to think about the average time per user, or the total amount of time spent in a given app, or sessions and so forth. And we continue to see amazing growth where you're talking about 1.6 trillion hours last year spent in apps. Kind of a big, hard to wrap your head around number, but I'll break that down for you a bit in just a moment. And then from a revenue standpoint, these numbers you see here, the 95 billion to over 200 billion in 2020, is representative of publisher revenue as they earn it through the app store, so Google Play, the Apple App Store, third-party Android, and through in-app advertising. That doesn't even include the commerce and transactions that are starting to really take off within the app ecosystem. So we know that apps are fundamentally transforming industry, right? You think about how it affects our lives, how we work, how we live, how we play on a day-to-day basis is continuing to evolve. And this means that we're seeing new competitors come into the marketplace, but we also see a new wave of competition happening because of the demand from consumers for mobile first and the innovation we're seeing from players in this space. And if you take it a step further, a key metric to keep in mind is that when we are on our phones and you think about the time spent between browser and app, 85% of our time are spent in apps. 85% of our time is spent in apps. That means 15% on browsers. And what that means is browsers can be a great on-ramp to initially engage your customers. But if you want to have an ongoing engagement with them, if you want to have an ongoing relationship to, frankly, personalize and optimize that experience, it is about that native app experience. And the other thing was we see consumer expectations continuing to evolve and transform. And when you think about this notion of customer expectations changing, think about what ride sharing's done. I don't think most people were thinking that they needed to order and sort of have this frictionless experience, so to speak, before these companies came into the market. But what it's doing is not just transforming, let's say, transportation. It's transforming how we think about frictionless payment, for example. You get to your destination, you get out of the vehicle, and you're done. If you think about competitors, we're having a whole new creeping up set of competitors depending on the vertical that are also changing the rules of the game, changing the expectations of customers and end users. And this is critical and also driving some of these later to mobile companies to really rethink what does mobile mean for them. So when we think about the app market, we think of it as a life cycle. And the data that we ultimately advise companies on sort of goes through this overall process for companies. So you think about the initial discovery and strategy that companies need in order to form an app strategy. So what are the size of certain geographies or certain categories in terms of users, in terms of, let's say, downloads or revenue and so forth, so that you can better understand what those competitive and overall market dynamics are. And then, of course, as you start to then set your strategy of what you're going to build or who you're going to partner with, it then becomes about, obviously, how do you acquire your users? And there's organic and inorganic options in order to acquire your users. So organically, and I'll touch on this later, we see a number of key tools that are critical to drive those initial installs. And then, of course, paid UA really coming in the form of different forms of creatives and ads to drive those installs. But that install is just the beginning. Once you get that install, it's about what are you doing to drive ongoing engagement with your customers, to bring them back into the fold, what's happening in terms of sessions, what's happening in terms of retention. And then, of course, it all comes back to monetization and ROI. And so whether you think of that from the standpoint of actual App Store optimization, advertising, App Store monetization, or ad monetization, or direct transactional commerce, I'd even then pull in those that have an ROI that's indirect. I'll even briefly touch on banks. Banks are seeing transactions continue to thrive within mobile, and I'll share some of this with you a bit later, which then reduces their customer service costs and their branch costs. So there's a really broad set of ROI when it comes to the role of mobile and specifically apps. So let's jump into the traits of some of today's mobile customers. So at a high level, we see time on a global basis growing by 95% over the last 2 years, so almost doubling over the last 2 years of time spent in apps. And if you think about that in a more sort of coherent metric, on average, we are spending over 2 hours a day in apps. That equates to about a month out of each individual's life, on average. So there's some that are over and some that are under. That's the kind of metric we're talking about when we talk about time spent and this growth that we're seeing that's coming from both existing users spending more time, which means more opportunity to deliver value and share of wallet capture, but it also means that we're seeing an influx of more users, in particular from developing markets. The other interesting thing that I don't think a lot of people realize is what app habits have been created across these 3+ billion users. So on average, we're using 10 apps per day. So how many of you, by a show of hands, think that 10 is pretty close to the monthly average number of apps used? Average. How many of you think it's closer to 20? 25? 30? 35? Takers for north of 35? On average, consumers use 35 apps per month. In some markets, it's closer to 30. In a market like China, it's actually pushing 40, and that's a market where WeChat, you can do just about anything in that app, and they still use more apps than other markets. That's what we're talking about in terms of the overall engagement. It's not all happening in just one app, and that's what you see here in this visual. What you're looking at here is time spent per day across a number of markets. And then the bar on the left indicates time spent in the most, concentrated app, if you will, in each market. And in general, you're looking at about 17% time capture of the #1 app, which means that there is still 80% of our time that's spent in those, call it 9+ apps per day or 34-ish apps per month. And it's happening because it's not just about social and comms and things like email or maps. It's about all these industries and verticals that are transforming, both new and, in particular, quote-unquote, old. So let's talk about this context of industry very briefly about adapt or be displaced and disrupted. So what you're looking at here are just a few examples in terms of time spent year on year in these types of apps. And not surprisingly, when you look at communication and dating and lifestyle, for example, only growing at about a 15% year-on-year rate. And this makes sense because these are the categories, frankly, that are relatively mature, right? You had games very early on that understood the value of apps, bought into it, and are continuing to dominate in terms of things like App Store monetization. But then you had social and comms that really came into the fore right on its heels and has really dominated in terms of time spent. Entertainment's really interesting, and specifically video. This is an area, and I'll share with you a different statistic in just a moment, but this is an area where we've seen time spent grow phenomenally, and it's in part because of things like YouTube and YouTubers, but it's also because of premium content that's playing a greater and greater role on a global basis. But what's interesting is to see some of these newer industries that are really starting to buy in and invest in apps and really start to develop an app strategy, which means committing a certain amount of, frankly, headcount and dollars to make this strategy materialize. And so what you see, for example, in terms of finance, and so this is basically fintechs, finance apps, and even banking, you're seeing very strong growth in terms of year-over-year time spent. And I'd argue in finance, it's not really the most important metric. What's more important are sessions, and obviously users, because you actually want to keep the friction down. But if you look at a category like shopping, where we're seeing this 50% growth in terms of time spent, this is an example where we've seen over the last 18 months phenomenal growth in terms of time spent in shopping. Baskets go up as time spent goes up. We hear from our retail customers that the basket spend in the app is higher than what they see on the desktop. And part of this is because we're able to deliver a better and better experience for things like browsing and reducing some of that friction of commerce with some of the best-in-class retail apps through those applications. And I'll share a bit more on that in a moment, too. Travel and navigation, transportation are another sort of aggregate category that's seeing incredible growth. And so where maps have been a long-standing, relatively mature segment, we're seeing hospitality and travel apps start to really come into their own, and people starting to increasingly engage in things like bookings through these apps. So this is what we're talking about when we talk about the transformation of quote-unquote legacy or long-standing industries because of mobile, because of that embracing of this pocketable device that's always with us. So let's jump into 3 different of these deep dives here. So briefly, retail banking. What you're looking at on this slide is across these 4 geographies, the number of sessions of these top 10 retail banks on average in a given in a given year. And what you're seeing here, the main takeaway, is that in markets like the UK, France, we actually see it here in Holland, there's been a 2x increase in the number of sessions over the last 2 years. People are getting increasingly comfortable with different activities, not just checking balances, but making payments, checking credit scores, and so forth. In Germany, it's grown by 3x over the last 2 years. Switching gears a bit on video. So this is a revenue story that is particularly interesting, because if you look at App Store revenue, which is what this is representative of, what we're seeing is this incredibly strong growth of video and people being willing to pay in-app in order to get access to premium content. And yes, in particular, companies like Netflix, for example, Youku in China, and others have really led the trend in getting people to really think about taking advantage of the convenience of an App Store transaction. But we see incredible numbers in terms of some of these markets, and even Spain, which is relatively small, growing by 9x in terms of that monetization. The other one I want to share with you briefly as a deeper dive is around retail. And retail's really been a story of incredible transformation, and one, let's be honest, that is really in the thick of intense competition in terms of what brick and mortar companies have to deal with. So to explain this one, because this chart is admittedly more of an eye chart, on that x-axis are the average number of sessions for certain types of apps and geographies. And we classify them as essentially bricks and clicks, so those that have a physical presence, and digital first, or online first. And then on that y-axis is that year-over-year growth to give you a sense of, obviously, movement over the past year. A couple key things to take away. First, no surprise that these online and digital-first companies are leading. And it makes sense. They don't have the physical channel to take advantage of. But the other thing to keep in mind here is that it's through those apps that we start to better understand what are customers looking for. And part of it has to do with more instant delivery. For them, it's also about reducing the friction of some in-store experiences, and when they know exactly what they want, being able to get that transaction done in the app versus maybe needing to try something on. But bricks and clicks are seeing opportunity, and the reality is, when you look to some of these Western European markets, it's really been in this last year, we've started to see incredible growth and adoption of some of these retail experiences through apps. Where a year and a half ago to 2 years ago, a market like Korea, which you'll see at about 33 sessions per user per month, but obviously lower growth in the last year because it's already at such a high level. And so this is an example of the kind of transformation we're seeing and where we can learn from industry leaders on the digital side. So let's talk a little bit about the how before I wrap up and close down this session. So when we think about the how, I'll be honest, these are a few examples of use cases and best practices to take back and apply to your own mobile and app strategy. But this is just scratching the surface. So the first one I want to start off with or the first context to sort of head off with is around the why behind all this, right? We know that it's not just about the time spent, but there is an intense competition when you think about initial discoverability of apps, right? There are over 2 million apps available in the Apple App Store, 2.5 million in terms of Google Play. Obviously, most of those exist in both, but still well over 2 million apps across these app stores. So this increased competition for discoverability and engagement long-term is critical, and I'm going to apply some of these how-tos from a marketing standpoint as well. So if you start with, in particular, driving acquisition, ASO. So for a lot of you, I'm sure you know and have heard the term SEO for years, search engine optimization. ASO is equally important, in particular when you're talking about the mobile app space. So Apple will quote numbers of essentially 2/3 of downloads come from organic searches in the App Store, versus roughly 1/3 are paid UA. So think about that. It actually doesn't have to cost you a lot of money to get downloads all the time. If essentially you can model it out to those averages. And I'll give you an example here. So when you think about ASO, ASO is all about what are the right keywords so that when somebody's looking to get a certain job done, because I am a big fan of using a jobs to be done type construct, what are the keywords that drive them to find an app like mine, download it, and hopefully get value from it? So this is during holiday season, sort of the big shopping season in the US late last year in 2016, where an app called Retail renamed its app in the App Store to take advantage of keywords like Black Friday and then deals and coupons. And that increase, going from 6 or 7 from a rank standpoint up to 3, dramatically increased the number of downloads that they experienced. This is something that's free. You can do this today in terms of App Store optimization and how you title your app, the description of your app, and so forth. And this is a really fundamental tool to keep in your back pocket. The other important thing, we all know competitive intelligence is important. That's not rocket science. But there's so many more metrics available to us today than ever before. What you're looking at in this initial chart here of this particular app in Germany of 7TV is to look at essentially, think of a Venn diagram of the 7TV app and what other apps have a very high overlap of users. And not surprisingly, you see some of their core competitors having a very high overlap, and so Netflix, Amazon, and TV Spielfilm. So this is a good sense of getting sort of competitive dynamics. How is that changing over time in terms of this cross-app usage? But the other piece of the equation that gets interesting is when you're trying to get a sense of which apps kind of over or under index in terms of likelihood to use it. So for example, take that same app. What you see here is the users of the 7TV app are more likely than average to use these other apps. The list is longer, but we took some of the top 3. And the point here is this is an example where you can use information like this to better understand who could I partner with, who could I ultimately build a relationship with or drive user acquisition and partnerships, and even companies have used this from an M&A or an acquisition standpoint. And then of course, if you combine the two, where are users more likely to be that are also users of my competitor, in this case, let's say Netflix, and obviously using that as a way to target those people to potentially become your own customer. Innovation is the reason we're all here, I think. When you think about innovation, what's happening in the market today, yes, AI, VR, AR, you sort of name it, right? Location-based capabilities, et cetera. Innovation it has been here for as long as I can remember. Certainly, I've only been in tech my professional life, but the fact of the matter is consumers are more aware of innovation and the kinds of new capabilities that they have at their disposal than ever before. And this is why it's critical from a competitive standpoint to understand what consumers could potentially do and how you can serve them better. And a few examples, when you think about voice, voice is one of those things where it's a fantastic alternative UX for some instances. So not just, let's say, in the case of the home, but for certain types of transactional exchanges where you can reduce the friction through voice. It doesn't displace touch, but it's a way to augment and add some additional value by hopefully reducing friction for a consumer to get something done. Other key features, when you think about the role of the camera, right? The camera's not just about the camera, the role of AR with the camera, the role of using the camera in order to find out more information. Google at I/O yesterday touched on this particular issue as well. Facial recognition is an interesting one. So we've actually started to see, while a lot of banks, for example, are using touch in order to validate who the person is who they say they are as they log in, we've seen, for example, China Merchants Bank, that in late last year they announced the inclusion of facial recognition as a way to authenticate, and it's actually improved their overall engagement with customers by about 15% already in terms of their sessions and overall sort of customer satisfaction. And then when you think about push notifications, this is another one where notifications have been there for a long time, but it's also what's unique about apps over the web. It's an opportunity to prompt users, but you have to make sure and test for that and look at how it's ultimately changing your customers' behavior to see, did that notification prompt a positive response, or did it actually do the opposite and optimize for that in order to create overall long-term value? Listening to our customers is something that any of us that are commercial businesses understand, right? You have to use that feedback to improve your product and your service. An example here with Ryanair, it's really been something, we've seen 50 app updates over the last several years come out for that app. And what we've seen, it's really been in the last year where they made significant improvements around ease of use and using their ratings and reviews as a way to refine their app and deliver a better experience to their customers. And the last one I'll leave you with is around benchmarking to the competition. And so what you're looking at here, when you start to think about retention, so retention's critical, right? You get somebody to initially download your app, but what happens at D1, D3, D7, D14, D30? And how does that compare? Because it's the difference of that ROI being meaningful or falling short, which could be the difference of that next wave of investment made in your mobile strategy. So in conclusion, the app market continues to grow at a phenomenal pace. We see things like time spent doubling. We see, for example, the monetization continuing to grow by a compound annual growth rate of over 20% between just ads and app store transactions alone. And a lot of the growth in terms of new downloads, not all of it, but a lot of that growth is going to be fueled by emerging markets. And this is also going to be a fascinating thing to watch, because while there may be a lot of price sensitivity there, it's an opportunity to serve these customers, an additional 2+ billion customers over the next few years. And when you think about engagement, think about what ultimately drives that satisfaction. It could be about strictly time spent per user, or might be more about sessions, because that might be a better indicator of bringing down friction and serving your customers better. It's an incredibly hyper-competitive market, but the reality is there's a ton of resources and data available. We even have free tools, ultimately, that you can take advantage of, which I encourage you to go to appannie.com. You can get rankings. You can get some sort of ASO, sort of V1 data that you can take advantage of at no additional charge. But I appreciate you all listening to me here today, and I look forward to having some conversations after. Thank you.